Prologue. Who watches in the dark? Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? Not on a crowded street, not in a room full of people, but when you're alone, in your own home, a place where you should feel safe, somewhere familiar, where there shouldn't be anyone but you. You feel the gaze. It lingers, somewhere behind you, somewhere in the shadows. But when you turn around, there's nothing. You laugh it off, telling yourself it's just a trick of the light, exhaustion, your imagination. And yet, the feeling remains. Now think about this. What if it's not just your imagination? What if something or someone is really there, just beyond your sight? What if it's always been there, watching, waiting, learning your every move? We fear what we cannot see, but the greatest terror comes when you realize it can see you too. Now you have a choice. Turn away and pretend there's nothing there, or stare into the darkness, because the darkness is already staring back. The story begins. Part 1. Murder number 1. The game begins. The city was waking up slowly, wrapped in the dark shadows of an autumn morning. Brooklyn Heights had its own eerie beauty, Victorian-era buildings standing as silent witnesses to time, narrow streets bathed in the dim yellow glow of streetlights, and a hush that settled between the distant murmurs of early risers. But today, the neighborhood wasn't stirring because of alarm clocks or the smell of fresh coffee from nearby cafes. Today, the police were here. Detective Ray Devereaux arrived at the crime scene at 5:40 a.m. The call had come in 30 minutes earlier, and while he despised early morning shifts, something in the dispatcher's voice had made him get up without hesitation. He'd been with homicide for over a decade, seen it all, from routine drug-related executions to full-blown ritualistic killings. But this one felt different. "Devereaux, over here," Captain Marshall called out, waving him over. His face looked worn, his lips pressed into a thin line. That was never a good sign. Ray stepped past the police tape and into the darkened townhouse. The smell hit him immediately. Metallic, bitter, laced with the damp rot of an old building. Blood. The air was thick, heavy, as if the walls had absorbed the horror. He'd been in places like this before, but something about this crime scene felt off. The victim lay sprawled in the center of the living room. A man, mid-40s, dressed in a gray bathrobe now soaked in red. His face was frozen in a grotesque mask of terror, eyes wide open, staring into nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the message smeared on the wall behind him, written in blood. "He is coming." Ray tensed. Too theatrical, too deliberate. This wasn't just a murder, this was a stage. Everything about it screamed intent. The killer hadn't rushed. They had taken their time, working with precision, with control. Cases like these were rare. Killers like these, they enjoyed their work, and that was the most disturbing part of all. "What do you think?" Marshall asked, crouching near the body. Ray studied the letters. They weren't scrawled in panic or rage. They were written carefully, methodically, almost neatly. "This isn't just a killing," he said quietly. "It's a message." A figure stepped into the doorway. John Carroll, forensic psychiatrist. One of the best consultants on cases like this. Tall, lean, with deep lines on his forehead that suggested a lifetime of overthinking. He took one glance at the body and exhaled. "Symbolism. Ritual," Carroll murmured. "Looks like our killer wants to be understood." "Did they leave anything else?" Ray asked, standing up. "There's something you should see." the medical examiner said, motioning toward the corpse. Ray crouched down again. That's when he saw it, a carved symbol on the victim's right hand. Not just a random gash, but a precise mark, almost like a twisted mix of letters. It looked familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Shit," he muttered. "What does it mean?" Carroll crossed his arms, stepping in for a closer look. A code, a signature, or a warning. Then Ray noticed something else. A phone lying just beside the victim's right hand. Someone had powered it off before death. The screen was black, but the man's fingers were still curled around the device, as if he'd been trying to make one last call. "Do we have anything on the phone?" he asked the examiner. The man held up the bagged evidence. "It's turned off, but if we're lucky, we'll find recent calls or messages." Ray nodded, but a feeling was gnawing at him. That phone hadn't been dropped. It had been placed there. Just like the body. Just like the symbol. He is coming. Ray couldn't shake the feeling that someone really was coming. Someone he hadn't seen yet, but someone who was already watching him. Part 2. Murder number 2. The system. The sun had risen over the city, but its light did nothing to lift the heavy tension weighing down the investigation team. The morning air felt thick, like even the day itself knew something was wrong. Ray Devereaux sat in his office, flipping through the coroner's report. The blood-written message, the symbol carved into the hand, the powered-off phone. Everything about this was deliberate, controlled, too precise for a random killing. And the killer had left exactly as many clues as they wanted. No more, no less. Ray knew that much. He just couldn't figure out the connection yet. Leaning back in his chair, he rubbed his temples and stared at the ceiling. Theories ran through his head, but none of them felt solid. He opened the case file and studied the crime scene photos again, eyes locking onto the smeared red letters on the wall. He is coming. The sharp buzz of his phone shattered his focus. "Shit," he muttered, glancing at the screen. Incoming call. Precinct. "Devereaux, we got another one." Captain Marshall's voice was curt, clipped. "Get to 124 Main Street. The bastard didn't make us wait long." The crime scene was already swarming, more people than usual. Yellow police tape cut off part of the block, and clusters of civilians gathered on the sidewalks, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered among themselves. Some filmed on their phones. Others just stood there, hands over their mouths, unable to process what they were seeing. Another body, another stage. The victim, a woman in her early 40s, was found in her second-floor apartment in an old brownstone. Everything about the scene mirrored the last murder. Same positioning, same method, but this time, the message on the wall was longer. "Time's up. He's already here." Ray scanned the room, his eyes immediately locked onto the victim's right hand. The same carved symbol. "This isn't a coincidence," he muttered. "No," a voice behind him agreed. "It's a system." John Carroll stood in the doorway, observing the scene with his usual detached expression. Slowly, he stepped inside, walking past Ray, his gaze flicking over every detail. "Do you feel it?" Carroll asked. "This is a message. Every mark, every action, it all means something." "I want to know what," Ray said flatly. "Then you'll have to think like him," Carroll murmured. For just a moment, his voice sounded off. Ray clenched his jaw. He hated that look Carroll got, like he wasn't staring at a corpse, but a work of art. Shaking off the thought, he turned his attention back to the room. Everything was too clean. No fingerprints, no signs of struggle. Just the body, the blood, the message. Anything useful? Ray asked one of the officers taking witness statements. Not much, sir. The officer shrugged. Security cameras near the entrance have been busted for weeks. No one in the building heard anything. Bullshit, Ray muttered. Someone had to see something. Or they don't want to talk, Carol added. Ray glanced toward the window. From here, you could see the parking lot below. He pictured the killer walking out unnoticed, slipping into the shadows, leaving no trace. Or they know they're next if they open their mouth, Ray murmured. Something about this wasn't right. The tension was growing, like an invisible wire tightening around his throat. Then his phone vibrated again. Unknown number, new message. He's getting closer. You feel him, don't you? Part 3. The psychological game Ray sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen. Victim files, crime scene photos, call records, it was all right there, yet the real connection remained just out of reach. 2 bodies, 2 messages, the same carved symbol. It was a chain. But the missing link, the one that explained why these people were being targeted, still eluded him. His mind kept circling back to Carol's words. Then you have to think like him. Was the killer following a calculated plan, scripting every step ahead of the investigation? It seemed likely. More than that, it explained why he was leaving such blatant messages. He didn't need to hide. He wanted to be understood. Ray opened a fresh file. A spreadsheet of names, professions, connections. He could feel it. The answer was right in front of him. He just wasn't seeing it. The door swung open, and Kay Marlowe walked in, gripping a stack of papers. Her dark hair was slightly disheveled, and faint shadows under her eyes hinted at a long night. She was working as hard as he was, and somehow that was reassuring. Devereaux, look at this, she said, tossing the papers onto his desk. I dug deeper into both victims. They were connected. Ray skimmed the documents. Victim number 1, a lawyer. Victim number 2, a legal secretary. 5 years ago, they were both involved in the same case. The disappearance of a young man, no body, no arrests, a cold case. This is revenge, Ray muttered. Someone's making sure justice gets served. And if that's true, Kay asked, crossing her arms, who's next? Ray's eyes flicked to the list of names. Judge, prosecutor, other legal staff. Someone here could be the next target. He quickly made a copy of the files and set the originals aside. Then something else caught his attention. Kay, look at this. He slid a document toward her. Check the court date on this case. 5 years ago. Now look at the date of the first murder. Kay's eyes moved across the page. Her expression shifted. They match, she whispered. Exactly, to the day. If this isn't random, then the killer is working on a strict timeline. Ray said, pacing. He has a motive. He has a list, which means he's not stopping anytime soon. I saw Carol at the second crime scene, Kay said, folding her arms. He was watching you, like he wanted to see how you'd react. Ray turned to face her. She wasn't just throwing out random theories. She suspected something. And the worst part? So did he. Carol said this was a system, Ray murmured. If he's right, the killer is following a precise order. Kay leaned over the desk, lowering her voice. What if Carol isn't just an observer? What if he's... Ray cut her off. No way. He's been consulting with law enforcement for years. That doesn't mean anything, she countered. You said it yourself. The killer is playing a game. What if the game isn't against the police? What if it's with the police? Ray wanted to dismiss it outright. It was ridiculous. But then why did his gut twist at the thought? Why did a part of him feel like she might be right? His phone vibrated sharply, cutting through the silence. Unknown number. Incoming call. Ray answered immediately. Devereaux, he said, voice clipped. Silence. Then a whisper, barely audible over the static. He's closer than you think. A cold chill spread down Ray's spine. His grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? He demanded, forcing his voice to stay steady. But the line had already gone dead. Kay saw the color drain from his face. What happened? She asked. Ray looked at her, voice firm but low. We need to find the next victim. Now, part 4, insomnia. Ray couldn't remember the last time he'd slept properly. His days blurred into an endless chase for an invisible enemy, and his nights were consumed by thoughts that refused to quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same messages, the same symbols. He is coming. Time's up. He's already here. But who the hell was he? The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. His office was the only one in the precinct still lit. In front of him lay the 5-year-old cold case file, the one that felt like the key to everything. A discarded coffee cup sat on his desk, cold and half empty. Scattered across the surface were crime scene photos, interrogation transcripts, police reports, documents he had read over and over again, searching for the one piece he'd somehow missed. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but stopping wasn't an option. His phone vibrated. Again. Same unknown number. Ray hesitated, staring at the screen, before finally answering. Devereaux, he said, his voice rough. Silence. Then, the sound of slow breathing. He's watching you. Ray shot up from his chair, eyes darting around the room. The feeling of being watched coiled around his spine like a vice. He stormed to the door, yanked it open, and peered into the dimly lit hallway. Nothing. But his pulse hammered in his ears like a warning. He stepped back inside and locked the door. His fingers trembled slightly as he shoved the papers aside and wiped a cold sheen of sweat from his forehead. He needed to pull himself together. Slowly, he turned toward the mirror, hanging on the opposite wall. His reflection looked wrong. The dark circles under his eyes, the hollow exhaustion in his face, he barely recognized himself. I don't look like myself anymore, he whispered. And then, it happened. For a split second, his reflection didn't move in sync with him. It lagged, like a fraction of a second, behind his actual motion. Ray stepped back, his pulse spiking. Just exhaustion. Just lack of sleep. That's what he told himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something in that mirror wasn't right. Kay Marlowe found him, an hour later, standing by the window, staring down at the empty streets. She took one look at him and frowned. Ray, what's going on? Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of concern beneath it. He didn't answer right away. Finally, without looking at her, he murmured, I'm starting to doubt what's real and what's not. She stepped closer, studying his face. He looked wrecked, drained. You haven't slept in days, she said, crossing her arms. You need rest. Rest? His lips curled into a humorless smile. I keep getting calls from someone who knows everything. He knows I'm looking for him. He's playing with me. Kay's expression tightened. What did he say this time? Ray finally turned to her. His voice was quiet, but firm. He said he's watching me. Kay swallowed. She didn't want to show how much those words rattled her, but she could feel it. the same unshakable sense that something was closing in, that they weren't just hunting the killer anymore, they were part of the game, and they had no idea what the rules were. "We need to find him before he finds you," she said. Ray finally tore his gaze away from the window and looked at her. For the first time in a long while, he realized he wasn't the only one who felt it. Something was in the air, something unseen, but undeniably there, and it was getting closer. Part 5, Losing Control. Ray could no longer ignore the feeling that he was losing control. Days blurred into an endless haze of exhaustion, and nights felt even heavier. His body ran on autopilot. His mind clung desperately to any detail that might lead him to the truth. But deep down, he knew someone was leading him astray. Someone was making him doubt his own thoughts. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was real. A handprint left on his fogged-up bathroom mirror. Strange noises at night, the subtle shifts in the objects on his desk, just enough to make him question if they had always been that way. It could all be tricks of his exhausted mind. Or maybe it wasn't. Kay was waiting for him in the precinct's conference room when he finally managed to pull himself away from his files. She had a set of new documents in her hands, and her laptop was open, a paused security camera feed frozen on the screen. The look on her face was tense, uneasy, like she had just uncovered something she wished she hadn't. "I have something," she said instead of a greeting. "I pulled security footage from a camera near the second crime scene." Ray sat across from her, rubbing his temples as he tried to focus. Kay hit play. The screen flickered to life, showing a dark, nearly empty street. A single figure moved across the intersection, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped, right in front of the victim's building. Ray narrowed his eyes, trying to make out details. The cameras were old, the footage grainy, but the outline of the figure was clear. A man, medium build, dark coat. Something about the way he moved felt familiar, too familiar. A cold unease tightened in Ray's stomach. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice low. Kay paused the video and zoomed in, her fingers curled into a fist. "It's you, Ray." His whole body tensed. He felt the air leave his lungs. It was him. But he had no memory of this. "That's impossible," he whispered. I was at the precinct." His breathing turned shallow. His fingers pressed against his temples, as if that could somehow force the memory to surface. But there was nothing. Could he have gone there? Was he in some altered state of consciousness? Was this some kind of sick manipulation? The footage could be fake, a setup, but deep inside, he knew it wasn't. It's just someone who looks like me," he tried, grasping at logic. Kay's eyes searched his face, filled with both worry and something else. Doubt. "Ray, please," she said softly. "You're not sleeping. You're barely eating. If you're blacking out, this is serious." He shook his head, as if denying it would somehow erase the possibility. "I think you need to rest," she continued, "because if it's not you, then someone wants you to think it is." Ray wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer. His fingers absent-mindedly brushed against the pocket of his coat, like his body already knew something his mind didn't. He reached inside and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Slowly, he opened it. His stomach clenched. There was only one sentence written inside. "You're next, Part 6, The Darkness." Within, Ray stood in his office, staring at the small scrap of paper trembling in his fingers. "You're next," His own handwriting, his own letters. But he didn't remember writing it. His heart pounded, the blood in his temples roaring like a distant train. Was this another cruel trick of his exhausted mind? Or was someone playing him? Someone who already knew his weaknesses? He dropped into his chair, eyes locked on the wall in front of him. Time was breaking apart. Days and nights blurred into one endless flow. He started realizing there were gaps in his memory, things he should remember, but didn't. Dinner last night, how he got home, who he spoke to. His call logs showed numbers he didn't recognize. But the worst part? The voice, a whisper on the edge of reality. It's you. It's always been you. Ray clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push the thought away. He grabbed his phone and dialed Kay. "We need to talk," he said, skipping any kind of greeting. "I'm already on my way," she answered. Her voice was tight with concern. Kay arrived 20 minutes later, looking as sleep-deprived as he felt. "What the hell is going on, Ray?" she asked as she stepped into his office. Wordlessly, he handed her the note. She scanned the words, and a visible shiver ran through her. "This is your handwriting," she said. It wasn't a question. "But I didn't write this, Kay." Ray's voice was raw. I don't remember doing it." Kay exhaled sharply and sat down across from him. She studied his face, searching for answers he himself didn't have. "Ray, when was the last time you slept?" she finally asked. He didn't respond right away because he couldn't. The harder he tried to remember, the more he realized he had no idea. I don't know," he admitted at last. Kay pressed her lips into a thin line. "This could be memory loss from exhaustion. Or..." She hesitated, as if debating whether or not to say what was really on her mind. "Or what?" Ray asked, tension coiling inside him. "Or someone is manipulating you, making you doubt yourself." She glanced at the note, still lying between them. "And whoever they are, they're doing a damn good job." Ray clenched his fists. He could feel it. His mind wasn't his own anymore. Something was twisting inside him, pulling him in directions he didn't understand. But who? And why? He pushed himself to his feet and started pacing. If this is someone else, what the hell do they want? Why are they making me think I'm the next target? Why are they making me... He froze mid-sentence. A new thought slithered into his mind, one even more terrifying than the rest. "Kay, what if it really is me? What if I actually wrote this, but just don't remember?" Kay didn't answer. She didn't have to. He could see the truth in her eyes. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "You don't know that," she said softly. "You're having memory lapses, Ray. If you can't remember what you did last night, then how can you be sure you didn't write this?" Ray stood completely still. Something inside him snapped. She was right. He couldn't be sure. "We need to find answers," he finally said, his voice steady but cold. "I'm with you," Kay replied. But in her voice, he could hear something else. Fear. She wasn't sure anymore whether she was still speaking to Detective Ray Devereaux or to someone else entirely. Part 7, Obsession with the Case. Ray couldn't stop. He flipped through documents, checked records, re-watched the surveillance footage over and over. His brain was operating at the edge of exhaustion. But something about this case wouldn't let him go. The answer was close. He could feel it, lurking in the tiny details he kept missing. But every time he tried to piece it all together, the puzzle fell apart. His hands were shaking. His eyes burned from relentless strain. He hadn't eaten or slept in days, And when he closed his eyes, even for a second, all he could see were those same bloody letters on the walls, the same symbols that had been haunting him since the first murder. The room felt alive, like the walls were breathing in sync with him, pulsing to the rhythm of his heartbeat. Kay sat across from him, watching him closely. She saw the changes, the dark shadows under his eyes, the way his movements had become sharp, restless, the way he avoided answering questions directly, how he got lost in his own thoughts so deeply that sometimes he didn't even hear her. She had seen that look before. People who stared too long into madness, and it terrified her. "Ray, you can't keep working like this," she finally said. "You need to rest. You need to step away." "Step away?" He lifted his head, eyes glinting with something feverish. "Are you serious? Someone is killing people. Someone is playing with me, and you want me to just go home and sleep? If you don't stop, you're going to lose control," Kay warned. "And then you won't be able to help anyone." Ray laughed, but it wasn't his usual laugh. It was short, dry, hollow. It didn't sound like him at all. "Maybe I already have," he muttered, staring at his trembling hands. Kay felt a sickening weight settle in her chest. She was losing him. She had seen men like this before, detectives who let the darkness of a case consume them. Some ended up in psychiatric wards, others in the morgue. "You need to sleep," she said softly. "Just for a few hours." Ray shook his head violently. "No time," he whispered. "If I fall asleep now, I might not wake up." Kay froze. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ray leaned in closer. His voice was so low, it sent chills down her spine. "He's waiting, Kay. He's already here. I can feel him inside me." A shiver ran through her. She didn't know who he meant, but her gut told her that if Ray didn't stop soon, he wouldn't come back. The desk lamp flickered. Ray's head snapped up, eyes locking onto it like it was some kind of sign. His fingers dug into the edge of the table. "It's him, Kay," he whispered. "He's showing me I'm on the right path." "Ray, it's just a faulty wire," she tried to reassure him, but even she didn't believe her own words. Suddenly, Ray's phone vibrated. Without hesitating, he snatched it off the desk and pressed it to his ear. "Who is this?" His voice shook. A deep, distorted whisper came through the line. "You already know." Ray slowly set the phone down. His fingers had gone white from gripping it so hard. Kay watched as something inside him shifted. The fear, the exhaustion, the realization. He exhaled shakily. "He's playing with me, Kay," he whispered. "And you know what? He's winning." Part 8. The Mad Night. Ray had no idea how long he had been sitting there in the dark after the call. His fingers were still wrapped around his phone, though the screen had gone black long ago. The room was suffocatingly silent, broken only by the faint crackling of the flickering lamp, as if someone was toying with the electricity, mocking him. Kay said nothing, but he could feel her eyes on him. "We need to do something," she finally spoke, her voice distant, almost disconnected. "He's already here, Kay," Ray whispered. "He's close. I know it." She took a step toward him, reaching for his arm, but he recoiled violently, as if her touch might burn him. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Her voice wavered, like she wasn't just asking him, but herself. Ray lifted his head, staring at her. His pupils were blown wide. There was something in his gaze, something that wasn't him. "Kay," his voice cracked. "If I lose my mind, will you tell me?" Her expression froze for a second. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, she said, Yes. Ray took a deep breath, exhaled, and then, finally, he stood up. Then let's go, he said. If he's really close, I want to meet him myself. Kay watched as he grabbed his coat, tucked his gun into his waistband. His hands had stopped shaking. He looked calm, too calm, and that scared her even more. The night outside was drenched in darkness. Rain trickled down car rooftops in thin, snaking lines. They got into the car. Ray started the engine without a word. Where are we going? Kay finally asked. Ray didn't answer immediately. His fingers were clamped around the steering wheel, knuckles white. Only after they merged onto the main road did he finally say, in a voice barely above a whisper, where it all began. The road stretched endlessly ahead of them, slick with rain, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. The sound of water slapping against the windshield felt too loud. Kay didn't take her eyes off Ray. His profile looked different, sharper, tighter, like there was someone else underneath his skin. You could at least tell me what exactly we're looking for, she pressed, trying to keep her voice steady. Ray flicked a glance at her, then back at the road. Answers. Kay frowned. And you think you'll find them there? Ray's jaw clenched. I don't think. I know. A chill prickled down her spine. She had never seen him like this. His certainty terrified her. 30 minutes later, they turned off the main road. Ray slowed the car to a stop in front of a derelict building on the outskirts of town. A warehouse. It loomed against the night like a rotting corpse. Windows shattered, walls caked in moss and decay. Even inside the car, the air felt colder. Ray cut the engine and stepped out. He didn't wait for Kay, didn't say a word. Cursing under her breath, she fumbled with her seatbelt and hurried after him. Ray, wait. She grabbed his arm. He didn't flinch, but when he turned to her, his eyes, God, there was something in them that made her step back. He was here, Kay, he said, calmly. I know it. Kay felt her pulse skyrocket. Who is he? She snapped, her patience shattering. Ray didn't answer. Instead, he pushed forward, straight toward the warehouse doors. The metal groaned as he shoved them open, hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the darkness was thick, almost tangible. The air stank of rotting wood, dust, and something else. Something faintly metallic. Kay flicked on her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the interior. Empty shelves, shattered glass, scattered debris. But then, Ray, she whispered. Her hand shook. The flashlight stuttered. At the center of the warehouse, a chair, and on it, a note. Ray approached slowly. His heart was hammering so hard, he swore Kay could hear it. He picked up the paper, read the words. You're too late. Part 9. The Truth Unveiled. Ray stared at the note, his entire body turning cold. You're too late. What did it mean? His fingers tightened around the paper as if he could squeeze the answer out of it, even though he already feared what it might be. His mind raced. Was this a warning? A taunt? Or a sign that they had indeed been on the right track, but arrived too late? Kay moved closer, cautiously. She could feel the tension in the air. Thick, suffocating. She saw the way Ray's fingers clenched around the note, the way his breathing had deepened. He looked like a man on the verge of unraveling. This is a trap, Ray, she whispered. We don't know what else might be here. Ray didn't answer. He took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the warehouse, darting between the dark corners. His ears tuned into every creak, every distant drip of water leaking through the ceiling. The damp boxes, Rusted metal scraps and mold-covered walls told a story of decay. But there was something else. Something in the air, something faint, barely noticeable, but enough to make his gut twist. This wasn't just an abandoned place. This was a message. Kay hesitated before moving toward the chair. Something felt off. She reached out, her fingers lightly grazing the worn wooden surface, then stopped. A chill ran down her spine. "Ray," she whispered, "there's blood." Ray turned immediately. Kay raised her flashlight, illuminating the seat. Small, dried droplets of dark red had seeped into the wood, leaving blurred, rusty stains. Someone had been here. Someone had bled here. Ray's pulse hammered in his ears. His mind was screaming a single thought. This wasn't just a location. This was a scene. Then, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. Kay sucked in a sharp breath, instinctively glancing at the screen. Unknown number. She looked up at Ray, her grip on the phone tightening. "Don't answer it," she said, her voice firm but shaking ever so slightly. Ray ignored her. He pressed accept. Silence. Then breathing, heavy, measured. Ray's stomach twisted. "Say something," he commanded. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, then finally a whisper. "You're always too late, Detective." Ray's blood ran ice cold. His throat tightened. "Who are you?" His voice was steady, but inside, something cracked. A soft, almost amused chuckle slithered through the speaker. It was quiet, but it was wrong. "I'm closer than you think." And then, the line went dead. Ray stared at his phone, the dark screen taunting him. No trace of a number, no record of the call. His shirt clung to his back, soaked in cold sweat. That wasn't just a joke. That wasn't just a threat. That was something else. "We need to get out of here," Kay said, her voice firmer this time. Ray slowly turned to her. There was real concern in her eyes, not just for the case, but for him. "No, Kay," he said, lifting his head, his voice sharpening like a blade. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to find him." Kay pressed her lips together. She knew that look. Unyielding, obsessive, dangerous. And she knew one more thing. If they stayed here too long, it might be the last mistake they ever make. Part 10, Hunting in the Dark. Kay felt the panic rising in her chest. Ray was acting like this was his only chance to uncover the truth. His gaze had turned sharp, cold, detached. She had seen that look before. People who stared too long into the abyss and had the abyss stare back. "Ray, you can't stay here," she said, firmly. "This place, it feels wrong." "Wrong?" He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Kay, everything about this case is wrong, but this is the only lead we have." He moved through the warehouse with slow, measured steps, sweeping his flashlight into the dark corners. His movements were precise, almost mechanical. Kay stayed close, even as every instinct inside her screamed that they needed to get the hell out. She noticed how his fingers curled into a fist each time he heard a sound, like a hunter catching the scent of blood. Then click. Ray froze. His gun was up in an instant. Kay's heart slammed against her ribs. The sound had come from somewhere deep inside the warehouse, past the collapsed shelving units. Her flashlight trembled in her grip as she aimed it toward the noise. Nothing. Just dust, debris, and darkness. "Who's there?" Ray's voice cut through the silence like a blade. No answer. Kay's fingers clenched around the cold metal of her gun. She didn't trust this darkness. There was something inside it. Something waiting. She took a cautious step forward. The old wooden floorboard creaked beneath her boot. It was the only sound that broke the stillness. But then, a rustling, faint, from the far end of the warehouse where the light didn't reach. Something was moving. Kay felt ice slide down her spine. Ray stood still, gun raised, his hand barely trembling. "We need to go," she whispered. "What if he's still here?" Ray's voice was low, but there was a dangerous edge to it. "What if he's waiting for us to leave?" Kay barely breathed. "What if he's not alone?" she whispered back. Ray took another step forward, flashlight beam slicing through the dark. It caught glimpses of broken shelving, scattered boxes, splintered wooden pallets. But no one but them. Kay stepped closer. She couldn't let him lose himself completely. "Ray, this could be a trap," she murmured. "We don't know who we're up against. You said you wanted to find him, but what if he's already found us?" Ray didn't answer, but his grip on the gun lowered, just slightly, and then another sound. This time, a long, drawn-out creak, like something or someone shifting through the dark. Ray snapped the flashlight in that direction. Its beam illuminated a narrow corridor leading to the back of the warehouse. And at the far end, something moved. Kay wasn't sure what she had seen, but it looked like something slipping out of the light's reach. Her fingers went numb against the grip of her gun. "Who's there?" Ray hissed. Above them, the overhead light flickered. It buzzed, flared bright for a second. Then, total darkness. "Shit!" Kay staggered back, pulse hammering. Ray didn't move. He was waiting. "Kay," his voice was almost calm, "if something happens, run." "What? And just leave you?" Her voice shook with anger and fear. "This isn't up for discussion," he said. "You run." Kay didn't have time to argue, because the darkness moved, and this time, it was fast. Part 11, the dark silhouette. The darkness swallowed them whole. Kay held her breath, forcing herself to stay still. Somewhere deep inside the warehouse, something moved. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound sliced through the suffocating silence. Her fingers were freezing against the gun, the cold metal biting into her skin. Ray was motionless beside her. His flashlight had died. The moment the overhead lights went out, leaving them in complete blackness. But he could hear it. He could hear breathing in the dark. Uneven, deep, almost human. But something about it was wrong. Kay, Ray whispered, barely moving his lips. Slowly, back up. She took a step. Her boot slid slightly against the concrete floor, stirring up dust. The sound changed. The faint scratching turned into a slow, deliberate creak, like something large, shifting just beyond their sight. Then, suddenly, a light flickered at the far end of the warehouse. For a split second, it illuminated something. A silhouette, tall, unnaturally thin. It stood motionless, waiting. A black figure with no face. Or maybe a face they just couldn't see. Kay felt her heartbeat climb into her throat. "Ray," she choked out. The figure moved. Ray's gun was up instantly. "Freeze!" His voice echoed into the emptiness, but the figure didn't stop. It started moving faster. "Run!" Ray shouted. Kay didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted for the exit. But the darkness felt alive. It clung to them, pulling them in. Footsteps pounded behind them. Ray fired. The muzzle flash illuminated. Nothing. But the footsteps didn't stop. They only got faster. Kay reached the door and yanked at the handle. Locked. "Ray, it won't open," she gasped. He sprinted toward her, flashlight shaking wildly in his grip. The figure was closer now, and it was moving differently, jolting, twitching, like its body didn't have the right shape, like it was shifting as it moved. "This can't be," Ray whispered. Another shot. The bullet hit the wall, shattering the silence with its deafening echo. "Open it, Kay!" Ray shouted. She twisted the handle with everything she had. The metal groaned, and finally, the door gave way. The glow of the streetlight flooded in, slicing through the suffocating blackness. Ray backed out slowly, gun still raised. His eyes were locked on the spot where the figure had been seconds ago. But now, there was nothing. Just silence. Just darkness. They stumbled out, slamming the door shut behind them. Kay leaned against the car, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. Ray didn't answer. He just stared into the dark, knowing this game wasn't over. Kay turned to him, her hands still trembling. Ray hadn't holstered his gun. His fingers twitched slightly, his lips parted, like he was trying to say something, but couldn't find the words. "You saw him," Kay whispered. Ray was silent for a long moment. His eyes remained fixed on the warehouse, his expression haunted. Slowly, he nodded. "It was him," he murmured. "But how?" Kay looked back at the warehouse windows. She couldn't see anything, but she knew something was still there, watching them. Even now, Part 12. The game has begun. The cold night air wrapped around them as they burst out of the warehouse. Kay's heart slammed against her ribs, her pulse roaring in her ears. She turned back. The warehouse windows loomed behind them, dark and empty like dead eyes. Like the building itself was alive, watching them. Ray slowly lowered his gun, but he didn't holster it. His fingers still clenched the grip, as if he wasn't sure if this was over. "He didn't just show up," Ray muttered, his gaze locked on the building. "This wasn't random." Kay inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. "We don't know what that was," she said. "But if it was him," she turned to Ray, "then he's not afraid to be seen. He wants you to see him." Ray faced her. His eyes were dark, filled with doubt and something else, something she couldn't place. "This is a game, Kay," he said, and it just started. She wanted to argue, to tell him this wasn't a game. This was real, a nightmare tearing their lives apart. But the words stuck in her throat. Her phone buzzed. She flinched and yanked it from her pocket. Unknown number. She met Ray's eyes. He didn't say a word, but his jaw tightened. Kay hesitated, then answered. Silence. Only the sound of slow, steady breathing on the other end. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice raw. A beat of nothing, then a whisper. "You made the wrong choice." The line went dead. Kay stood frozen, staring at the phone as if expecting it to ring again. Her fingers felt damp. She hadn't even realized her hands were trembling. "Kay," Ray's voice was calm, but edged with something sharp. "What did he say?" She looked at him. "That we made the wrong choice." Ray said nothing. His grip on the gun tightened. Then his eyes flicked back to the warehouse. He felt it, like he was a piece in someone's game. Like every move he made was already planned out, but he had no idea who was making the next move. "We need to go," Kay said finally. "If he's watching us, that means he's already a step ahead." "No," Ray said. She blinked. "I want him to think we're scared," Ray continued, "but I'm not. I want to find him." Kay knew that tone. Stubborn, reckless, dangerous. "This isn't about fear, Ray. It's about common sense." She glanced around. The street was empty, but it felt like eyes were on them. Every sound in the darkness made her pulse skip. She didn't want to admit it, but Ray was right. This was a game. And whether they liked it or not, they were playing. Part 13, Footsteps in the Dark. Kay and Ray left the warehouse behind, but the unease clung to them. She felt it, that invisible gaze, like something unseen was still watching. The street was too quiet, too empty, like a set piece, waiting for the next act of this nightmare. Ray silently walked to the car and pulled open the door. Kay hesitated. She turned back. The warehouse windows were black voids, stretching into nothing. She knew no one was there. But was that really true? She got in the car, her eyes locked on her phone screen. Unknown number. No follow-up call, no message, just a signal. A warning. Drive, Ray muttered, starting the engine. The car pulled away. In the rearview mirror, the warehouse faded into the darkness, but the feeling that they were still inside its trap never left. We can't just run, Kay said quietly. If he's watching us, if he knows our every move, we have to change the game. Ray didn't take his eyes off the road. And how do you propose we do that? She thought for a moment. Then, almost unconsciously, her fingers tightened around her phone. He thinks we're victims, she said. We make him believe we're not. Ray's lips curled into a faint, dangerous smile. You want to lure him? What if he already lured us? Kay met his gaze. What if we've been playing by his rules this whole time? Ray didn't answer, but his eyes darkened. Then, his foot pressed harder on the gas. Then it's time we find out who we really are in this game. The rain started to fall as they sped down the empty highway. The road was slick. The headlights sliced through the dark, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Inside the car, the air grew colder, like driving forward meant sinking deeper into something unseen. Ray gripped the wheel, fingers tense, jaw clenched, silent. But Kay knew what he was thinking. She was thinking it too. If he really controls this, she said, he's tracking us. Cameras? Hacking? Or maybe... Ray glanced at her. Or maybe he's close. The words made Kay's stomach tighten. She checked the side mirror. Nothing but darkness, emptiness. But her gut screamed. They weren't alone. Are we making a mistake? She whispered. Ray smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was almost cruel. No. The mistake was his, thinking we'd play by his rules. The car slammed to a stop. Kay lurched forward, gripping the seat. What the hell are you doing? Ray killed the engine. They sat in pure blackness on a stretch of road with no streetlights. Only the night, pressing in like a silent audience. He leaned forward, turned off the headlights. If he's watching, Ray murmured, he's about to make a mistake. Kay held her breath, and then, through the rain, she heard it. Footsteps, somewhere in the dark, close. Part 14, the shadow that follows you. Kay held her breath, her body tensed, ears straining against the night. The footsteps, soft, deliberate, unavoidable. Someone was out there. Someone was watching them from the darkness. Ray didn't move. His hand drifted toward his gun, but he didn't fire. Not yet. He was listening, waiting, analyzing. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof of the car, masking the sound, but Kay still heard it. The footsteps. Closer. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her body froze. Her mind refused to accept the danger closing in around them. Ray, she whispered. I know. His voice was calm, too calm. The door swung open. The night breathed into the car, cold, suffocating, wrong. Kay instinctively reached for him, tried to grab his arm to stop him, but he was already outside, gun drawn. Standing in the open, the car's headlights were off, leaving everything beyond the door an abyss. Show yourself, His voice sliced through the rain. Silence. Just the wind. Just the storm. But something was out there. Kay felt her lungs tighten. They shouldn't have stopped. They shouldn't have given it time to get closer. A rustle to the right. Between the trees. Ray spun, gun raised. A shadow shifted, then vanished into the dark. "Ray, get back in the car!" Kay's voice cracked, but he didn't move. Something was watching them. And then, two faint glints appeared in the distance. Eyes, staring straight at them. A shiver raced down Kay's spine. The air felt heavier, thicker, like something was pressing against her chest, pinning her in place. She wanted to step back, but couldn't. Ray saw them too. He inhaled slowly, steadying his grip on the gun. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared, studying them. "It's him," Ray whispered. Kay's stomach twisted. "You're sure?" The eyes moved, slowly, not walking, gliding, as if the thing they belonged to wasn't following the same laws of movement. Kay's pulse hammered in her throat. Ray's finger tightened on the trigger. "Take one more step," he growled, and I pulled the trigger. The eyes hesitated. Then, a step. The sound of wet asphalt under heavy boots. Ray fired. A flash of light split the darkness. For a split second, the rain, the trees, the empty road, and nothing else. The eyes were gone. Silence. Just rain. Just emptiness. Kay's breath hitched. Where did it go? Ray's grip on the gun didn't loosen. His head snapped left, right, scanning, heart pounding. "He's playing with us." His voice was low. "He wants us to feel like we're losing." Kay exhaled, gripping the seat. She hated this game. She hated that they were part of it. "We need to go." Her voice was firm now. If they stayed 1 second longer, something would happen. Something they couldn't take back. Ray slowly nodded, still watching the dark, still waiting. He took a step back, another. They slammed the doors shut at the same time. The engine roared to life. Headlights sliced through the night. No movement, no sign of anything watching them. Kay exhaled. But then, she looked in the rearview mirror. Her stomach plummeted. There, standing in the distance, where nothing had been before, a figure, motionless, watching them. Final chapter. The last step into darkness. Kay's heart tightened in her chest. The figure stood in the middle of the road, just a few dozen feet behind them. It didn't move, but even from this distance, even through the curtain of rain, Kay knew it was looking right at them. Ray saw it at the same time she did. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He was on the edge. One more wrong move, and they were dead. "We can't just drive off," he whispered. "He won't stop." Kay didn't answer. She just kept staring into the mirror, trying to convince herself it was just a shadow, just exhaustion, just paranoia. But the figure was real. It was waiting. Then, the headlights flickered. The engine, strong and steady just a second ago, gave a low, choking sound, and then died. Shit. Ray slammed the ignition button. Nothing. Kay's body locked up, her hands frozen against the seat. In the mirror, she saw it. The figure moved. One step forward. Kay sucked in a breath. Another step. Ray's jaw tightened. His fingers slammed the ignition again. The dashboard blinked to life, then faded. The figure kept walking. "Out!" Ray barked, throwing his door open. Kay followed, even though every instinct screamed not to. The rain pelted her face as she drew her gun, gripping it so tightly her fingers went numb. Ray raised his weapon. "Who the hell are you?" His voice was hoarse, sharp with fury. The figure didn't answer. It stopped just a few feet away. The flickering streetlights carved broken shadows across its form. Too still, too calm, too knowing. You're running the wrong way, Detective. The voice was smooth, unbothered. Ray's hands went ice cold. What do you want? The figure tilted its head. That's not a question for me. You already know the answer. Kay staggered back. Ray, don't listen to him. But I'm already here, Kay. The figure murmured, finally turning toward her. I've always been here. The streetlights died. The headlights blinked out. The night swallowed them whole. And then something grabbed Ray. Kay screamed. She fired once, twice, 3 times. The gunshots ripped through the storm, blending with the thunder cracking the sky apart. The darkness closed in around her. Alive, writhing, endless. Ray! But he was already gone. Only the rain remained, only the night, and the same eyes. Still watching her, still waiting. The game was over. Moral of the story. The world around us hides more than we see. What feels familiar can change in an instant. We live in comfort zones, blind to what lurks just beyond them. Are you sure you know who's watching you? Do you truly understand the shadow following behind you? The pain you haven't felt, the fears you've never known, they exist. They are close. And one day, you might look in the mirror and see something else staring back. Darkness isn't always out there. Sometimes it's inside you.